September 1944. In the Palau Islands, the tiny coral speck of Peleliu measured less than 10 square kilometers. Yet here, the Americans believed they would wipe out the Japanese in just 3 days. In reality, beneath the limestone ridges of Umurbrogol lay a vast network of bunkers and tunnels prepared for months. More than 11,000 Japanese soldiers waited, sworn to defend every inch of ground. As the landing craft touched the beach, the earth erupted into a sea of fire. Peleliu, a small battle in a greater plan, quickly became a meat grinder, where every stretch of runway, every ridge, was bought with the blood of U.S. Marines. In the summer of 1944, the balance of power in the Pacific battlefield had tilted decisively toward the Allies. After victories in the Mariana Islands and New Guinea, America's encirclement of Japan tightened. Yet within the U.S., Joint Chiefs of Staff, disagreements arose about the next step. General Douglas MacArthur pushed for a swift return to the Philippines as a springboard into Japan, while Admiral Chester Nimitz favored bypassing the Philippines and instead seizing Taiwan and Okinawa to prepare for the assault on the Japanese mainland. Despite the differences, both plans required capturing the Palau Islands, including Peleliu, to eliminate Japanese bases on the flank. Ultimately, President Franklin D. Roosevelt approved MacArthur's plan to retake the Philippines. To secure the upcoming Philippine landing scheduled for late 1944, the capture of Peleliu and Angaur was deemed necessary. However, even at the planning stage, several U.S. commanders, notably Admiral William Bull Halsey, questioned the value of sacrificing American lives for such a small island. History would later prove those doubts correct, as the Battle of Peleliu turned out to be of little strategic significance. On Peleliu, about 11,000 Japanese soldiers from the 14th Infantry Division under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had spent months preparing their defenses. After devastating defeats from Guadalcanal to Saipan, Japan's high command shifted tactics. Instead of futile banzai counterattacks at the shoreline, they built a deep defensive system of bunkers, tunnels, and caves designed to inflict maximum casualties on the Americans. The island's treacherous terrain, dominated by the Umurbrogol limestone ridge, was turned into a fortress. Hundreds of natural caves were converted into strongholds, connected by a complex network of tunnels. Many cave entrances were reinforced with steel doors that could swing open to fire and then close to deflect grenades or flamethrower blasts. Inside, the Japanese positioned an array of weapons: 81mm mortars, 150mm artillery, 20mm machine guns, 25mm anti-aircraft guns, and even light tanks hidden as reserve firing points. These interlocking positions could support one another and retreat deeper into the mountain when necessary. Along the western beaches, a token force was left to slow the U.S. advance before withdrawing into the interior defenses. The beaches themselves were mined and rigged with preset artillery shells, turning the landing zones into death traps. The Americans committed the 1st Marine Division, about 17,000 men, under Major General William H. Rupertus. Confident of a quick victory, Rupertus predicted the battle would last only 3 to 4 days. The landing plan followed a familiar pattern. After heavy naval and aerial bombardments, 3 Marine regiments would storm the southwestern beaches near the main airfield. Colonel Lewis B. Chesty Puller's 1st Marines would hit the northern sector, White Beaches 1 and 2. Colonel Harold D. Harris's 5th Marines would assault the center, Orange Beaches 1 and 2. And Colonel Herman H. Hannikin's 7th Marines would take the southern flank, Orange Beach 3. Supporting them was the 11th Marine Artillery Regiment, along with battleships, cruisers, and aircraft carriers offshore. For 3 days before the landing, U.S. forces bombarded the island heavily, focusing on the airfield and coastal defenses. Yet the effect was minimal. Most Japanese troops had taken shelter deep within the ridges and only fired back sporadically to trick the Americans into believing their positions had been neutralized. This left U.S. commanders convinced they would face weak resistance, setting the stage for one of the bloodiest and most grueling battles in the Pacific War. On the morning of September 15, 1944, at exactly 8:32 a.m., the first wave of American forces stormed ashore at Peleliu. As soon as the amphibious tractors and landing craft touched the sand, the Japanese flung open the steel doors of their concealed bunkers and unleashed a torrent of gunfire. From the coral ridges to the north, 47mm cannons and 20mm anti-aircraft guns swept the flanks of the landing formation, inflicting heavy casualties. The ferocity of this resistance caught the Marines completely off guard, as U.S. commanders had believed the defenders were already crippled by days of naval and aerial bombardment. One Marine later recalled, "The third wave was safe, but the first two were pure hell." In less than an hour, about 60 amphibious tractors, LVTS, and numerous landing craft were destroyed, turning the beach into a flaming graveyard of metal. At the northern White Beaches, Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller's 1st Marines bore the brunt of the fire from a limestone headland jutting into the sea, which the Americans called the Point. No sooner had they landed than the regiment was pinned down by relentless fire raining from the Umurbrogol Ridge above. Puller himself narrowly escaped death when a 47mm shell struck the amphibious tractor he had just exited, obliterating his mobile command group. Moments later, another Japanese shell hit the regimental field headquarters, destroying all communications equipment and cutting contact with frontline companies. On the southern Orange Beaches, the 7th Marines faced the same nightmare. The moment they stepped off their craft, Japanese machine guns raked the shoreline. Several landing boats burst into flames, forcing Marines to leap into chest-deep water and slog across the coral flats under a hail of bullets. Casualties mounted rapidly, and those who managed to reach the shore were often without weapons or gear, leaving them nearly incapable of fighting. Only the central sector, held by Colonel Harold D. Harris's 5th Marines, was able to push inland on the first day. Their landing zone lay farther from the heaviest fortifications at the flanks, so they encountered less direct fire. This allowed them to drive forward quickly, spearheading an advance toward the island's main airfield. By midday, spearhead units had reached the edge of the runway. There, they were suddenly met with a fierce counterattack, personally ordered by Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. From the tree line, light Japanese tanks with infantry support burst forth, charging across the runway in a desperate attempt to smash into the American flank and drive them back into the sea. But the bold maneuver collapsed almost instantly. U.S. Sherman tanks surged forward to meet them, supported by 105mm howitzers firing from landing craft, naval guns offshore, and dive bombers from the carriers at sea. In a matter of minutes, the Japanese tanks and their accompanying infantry were annihilated, leaving charred wrecks strewn across the runway, grim proof that Nakagawa's hopes for a decisive counterattack were futile. By the end of September 15, 1944, American forces had established a beachhead about 3 kilometers wide along Peleliu's western shore. In the south, the assault pushed roughly 1 mile inland, while in the north, the 1st Marine Regiment remained pinned at the foot of the Umurbrogol Ridge under relentless Japanese fire from above. The first day ended with around 200 Americans killed and 900 wounded, a staggering toll amounting to nearly 10% of the attacking force in just 24 hours. Yet Major General William Rupertus remained confident, convinced that Japan's main defenses had been breached and would soon collapse, unaware that the enemy had shifted to a deeply entrenched defensive system hidden within the ridges. During the following week, the 1st Marine Division pressed its attack in 2 directions, southward to clear the remaining end of the island and northward toward the Umurbrogol Ridge. On September 16th, the 5th Marines seized full control of the airfield and began advancing straight to the eastern shore, cutting Peleliu in half. Surviving Japanese near the airfield clung to bunkers and the control tower, fighting to the death with machine guns, mortars, and artillery fire called in from the mountains. Heavy fire from the north caused further losses, but the 5th Marines crushed each pocket of resistance. By the end of the day, the American flag flew over the runway and the airfield's defenders had been wiped out. On September 17th, the advance reached the east coast, completing the island's split. Meanwhile, at the southern tip, the 7th Marines forced the Japanese into the last corner of the peninsula. Fighting there dragged on for several more days under blistering heat, with daytime temperatures soaring to 115 degrees Fahrenheit, 46 degrees Celsius. Shade was scarce, exhaustion spread quickly, and cases of heat stroke mounted alongside casualties from bullets and shells. The situation worsened as drinkable water was nearly non-existent. Supplies from ships were tainted with oil, and the only groundwater well near the airfield had been poisoned by the Japanese before the landing. Still, by September 23rd, the 5th and 7th Marines had finished their tasks, sweeping the southern half of Peleliu and tightening the ring around the northern ridge. With the airfield secured, the Americans immediately exploited it for support operations. On September 19th, light L-4 Grasshopper reconnaissance planes from VM-01 landed on the Peleliu runway and began constant aerial spotting, directing naval and artillery fire with precision onto Japanese positions in the mountains. By September 26th, a squadron of 24 F-4U Corsair fighter bombers from VMF-114 had also landed to provide close air support. Armed with rockets and napalm, the Corsairs proved devastating against the fortified cave network. Their 5-inch rockets blasted open steel doors, exposing firing points for infantry assaults, while napalm drenched the ridges in fire, stripping away camouflage and superheating the caves until oxygen was sucked out, suffocating the defenders and forcing them into the open, where they were immediately cut down. The arrival of on-island air support gave U.S. forces renewed confidence and the hope that the final Japanese strongholds on the Umurbrogol Ridge could soon be destroyed. Compared to the southern front, the fighting in the north of Peleliu, around the Umurbrogol Ridge, was even more ferocious. The dense jungle covering the slopes became a nightmare for the Marines at the base, where sudden bursts of mortar fire and sniper shots from above inflicted constant casualties along the northern beaches. To open the way forward, Colonel Lewis Chesty Puller decided to eliminate the most dangerous obstacle, the rocky promontory jutting out over the beach that the Americans called the Point. He assigned the mission to Company K, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, under Captain George P. Hunt. At dawn on September 16th, after naval guns had briefly suppressed the enemy's machine guns, Hunt led over 200 men along the rocky shore to the base of the Point, before suddenly charging uphill. They quickly reached the Japanese defenses but were met with ferocious fire. With most of their mortars, flamethrowers, and heavy machine guns lost during the chaotic landing, Company K had little more than rifles and grenades. Even so, the Marines used surprise to their advantage, storming one bunker after another with bold tactics, throwing smoke grenades to blind the defenders, then following up with fragmentation grenades or M7 rifle grenades. In this way, 6 fortified machine gun nests were knocked out in succession. When they came to a large cave housing a 47mm gun, a U.S. lieutenant tossed a smoke grenade through a crack, blinding the crew inside, while a sergeant crawled to the entrance and lobbed in a fragmentation grenade. A violent explosion silenced the gun, and the Japanese soldiers inside were either killed or forced to flee, only to be cut down immediately. By late morning, Company K had secured the point, but the victory only marked the beginning of a new ordeal. Recognizing its vital importance, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa immediately ordered repeated counterattacks to retake it at all costs. For the next 30 hours, the Japanese launched 4 furious assaults against Hunt's men. Isolated on the narrow ridge, short of water, and running out of ammunition, the surviving Marines fought with desperate bravery. They repelled wave after wave with whatever they had left. When their bullets were gone, they closed in with bayonets, knives, rifle butts, and even hurled coral rocks at the attackers. Through the night, Japanese battle cries mixed with gunfire, grenades, and the cries of the wounded on both sides. Against all odds, Company K held out. At dawn on September 17th, American reinforcements finally broke through, driving off the enemy and securing the point. The cost was staggering. Of the roughly 235 men who had started, only 18 remained unscathed, with 157 wounded, a 75% casualty rate. Yet their sacrifice eliminated one of the most dangerous strongholds guarding the landing beaches. Still, most of the Umurbrogol Ridge behind the point remained intact, waiting to challenge the Americans. Once their lines were stabilized, Marine units began launching deeper assaults into the cave networks hidden in the mountains. The Americans gave these places grim names like Bloody Nose Ridge and Death Valley, reflecting the savage intensity of the fighting. Through late September, Puller's 1st Marines and supporting units mounted dozens of attacks, but nearly all were quickly beaten back. They faced a labyrinth of interlocking fire, designed like a hornet's nest. Whenever they seized one cave or rocky outcrop, machine guns and mortars from neighboring positions raked their flanks. Every path between the ridges lay under crisscrossing fields of fire, leaving the Marines with heavy casualties for only minimal ground gained. The Japanese did not rely on firepower alone. They also used cunning harassment tactics to wear down the enemy. By day, their snipers deliberately targeted medics and stretcher bearers, knowing that if one man was wounded, at least 2 more would have to leave their posts to carry him to the rear. In this way, American manpower was slowly drained through calculated cruelty. At night, instead of launching wasteful banzai charges that only sacrificed men in vain, small Japanese squads crept out of their caves, infiltrating the lines to silently attack Marines in their foxholes. Learning from this, U.S. troops no longer slept alone. They dug 2-man positions so that one could sleep while the other kept watch, taking turns through the night to guard against sudden intrusions. The height of the carnage on the Umurbrogol came in the battle for a ridge the Americans designated Hill 100. The mission fell to the 1st Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment under Major Raymond Davis in late September. Over 6 days of relentless fighting, Davis's battalion suffered staggering losses of up to 71% of its strength. Leading the assault was Captain Everett P. Pope's company. It took them nearly an entire day of climbing steep cliffs to reach what Pope believed was Hill 100. By the late afternoon of October 3rd, about 90 Marines still fit for combat seized a rocky outcrop and hastily established a makeshift defensive line. But looming ahead was an even higher ridge, bristling with Japanese defenders. The outcrop was merely an outpost, not the true Hill 100. Stalled at the base of the final summit, Pope resolved to hold his position overnight, creating a perimeter while awaiting reinforcements. During the night of October 3rd to 4th, Japanese troops surged from surrounding caves in repeated counterattacks, determined to crush Pope's small band. In the pitch black, The Marines formed a defensive circle, repelling charge after charge. As their ammunition dwindled, they resorted to bayonets, entrenching tools, and even hurling coral rocks and empty shell casings at the attackers. Captain Pope himself fought in hand-to-hand combat multiple times under the flickering light of flares. After nearly 8 hours of desperate battle, dawn broke. Reinforcements had still not arrived, and only 9 exhausted men remained of Pope's force. Unable to hold out any longer, he ordered a withdrawal. When they finally reached the foot of the hill, Pope looked back to see the rocky slope littered with the bodies of his comrades. Nearly his entire company had been lost. Months later, for his extraordinary courage at Hill 100, Captain Everett P. Pope was awarded the United States' highest honor, the Medal of Honor. By early October 1944, the 1st Marine Regiment was virtually combat ineffective. Out of 3,000 men at the start, they had lost 1,749, roughly 60% of their strength. The entire 1st Marine Division was exhausted after more than 2 weeks of staggering casualties. Faced with this situation, Lieutenant General Roy Geiger, commander of the 3rd Amphibious Corps, was forced to commit his reserves. The U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division, nicknamed the Wildcats, and commanded by Major General Paul Muller, had originally been assigned to capture nearby Ulithi, but was now redirected to Peleliu. On September 23rd, just as the southern part of the island was declared secure, the 321st Infantry Regiment of the 81st Division landed on the northwest coast of Peleliu, striking into the rear of the Japanese positions on the Umurbrogol Ridge. The newly arrived Army battalions quickly joined forces with the battle-hardened survivors of the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments to continue the brutal fight in the mountains. Yet they soon realized they had entered a true meat grinder. The Japanese fought to the last man, determined to die in place rather than surrender, and inflicted severe losses on the reinforcements as well. By mid-October, nearly half of the 5th and 7th Marines had become casualties in the bloody attempts to advance up the Umurbrogol Heights. Recognizing the toll, General Geiger decided to withdraw the remaining Marine units from Peleliu, sending them to the rear for rest and reorganization. The remaining task on the island was handed over entirely to the 81st Infantry Division. On October 15th, the 323rd Infantry Regiment landed as reinforcements, replacing the last Marine companies, which were evacuated to Pavuvu in the Solomon Islands for refitting. By late October 1944, the U.S. presence on Peleliu consisted solely of the 81st Division. They pressed on with the grueling battle, seizing one cave after another across the Umurbrogol Ridge over the following weeks. It was not until late November 1944 that the final gunfire on the island at last fell silent. After more than 2 months of brutal fighting, on November 27, 1944, American forces officially declared full control of Peleliu. Before that, when the situation had become hopeless, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commander of the Japanese garrison, carried out the final ritual of a defeated soldier. In a message to Imperial Army headquarters, he reported, "Our sword has been broken and the spears are no more," signifying that the defense had been completely destroyed. He and the remaining officers then gathered the last survivors, burned the Rising Sun flag and divisional colors to prevent capture, and committed mass suicide with swords and rifles in the samurai tradition. For his steadfastness, Nakagawa was posthumously promoted to lieutenant general, remembered as a symbol of Imperial Japan's code of fighting to the death. Yet not all Japanese soldiers on Peleliu perished or surrendered in 1944. Hidden in the island's caves, isolated groups clung on. The final holdouts, a lieutenant and 34 men, remained in hiding for more than 2.5 years, refusing to believe the war had ended until April 22, 1947, when a Japanese admiral was sent to persuade them. Only then did they emerge and surrender, marking the last formal capitulation of an organized Japanese unit after World War II. Peleliu ended in American victory, but the cost was devastating. The 1st Marine Division suffered about 6,500 casualties, including more than 1,200 dead, the heaviest losses it endured in the entire war, forcing it to withdraw for refitting and leaving it out of action until Okinawa. The reinforcing 81st Infantry Division also lost around 3,200 men, with over 500 killed. On the Japanese side, nearly all of the 11,000 defenders fought to the death, with only about 200 taken prisoner, mostly Korean laborers forced to serve. The struggle for the Umurbrogol Ridge was later judged to be the most vicious battle faced by U.S. forces in the Pacific, with a casualty rate higher than any other amphibious assault of the war. Yet the island's strategic value proved meager. The airfield that cost so many lives to capture saw little use in MacArthur's Philippine campaign due to the limited range of aircraft at the time. Nor did Peleliu become the planned staging base for the invasion of Japan. Instead, the Allies chose Ulithi Atoll as their forward hub for Okinawa. In hindsight, many concluded that thousands of Americans had died for an objective that was not truly necessary. Admiral William Halsey had even advised canceling the Peleliu and Angkor assaults to concentrate on Leyte, but his recommendation was overruled. Ironically, after Peleliu, the U.S. abandoned plans to seize the rest of Palau's islands, showing that the battle forced commanders to be more cautious and to avoid needless attacks. The battle also received little coverage at the time. Convinced by General Rupertus's prediction of a 3-day victory, only 6 war correspondents accompanied the landing. When the campaign dragged on for over 2 months, news from Peleliu was overshadowed by MacArthur's dramatic return to the Philippines in October and major Allied victories in Europe. Only years later, through veterans' testimonies and war documentaries, did the public begin to grasp the ferocity of Peleliu. Despite its limited strategic value, the battle gave the U.S. military hard-earned lessons: Japan's new defensive tactics in depth, soon to be repeated at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and valuable experience for underwater demolition teams in reconnaissance and clearing beach obstacles. Most importantly, Peleliu sounded a grim warning about the horrific cost of amphibious warfare. For the Marines who fought there, it was an ordeal never forgotten. And at the U.S. Marine Corps Museum, Peleliu is remembered as the bitterest battle of the Marines in World War II. Bloody, controversial, and instructive, Peleliu endures in history as both a tragic testament to the Pacific War's savagery and a reminder of the deadly price of flawed strategic decisions.